Let's face it, parenting is the most important job on earth. Every day presents a stack of different challenges, and more often than not, the answer is outside of the box. On this podcast, we will offer proven strategies, interview pioneers in education, give insights into how to be successful parents, and even share our imperfect experiences of being parents ourselves. We're all in on this journey, and we will span the globe to find out what is working and who has the answers. This is the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast. Here are your hosts, Darren McCarthy and Brian Powers.
Welcome to the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast. I'm Brian Powers.
I'm Darren McCarthy.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
Fantastic. We're in quarantine week, 3 now?
I've lost count. But today we are talking to our friend, your mentor, Gayle Moyers.
Yes, Gayle Moyers, who's just put out her first book.
Yes, Learning Years.
It's called Tune Up Your Brain. Learning Years, Improving Results at Work and School. And this nice thing about this book, Brian, is that it's really easy to read. Sometimes, educational program books get really deep into what the offering is and how it's going to make how it's going to make changes and kind of a big reason on the why. This is more Gayle's testimonials. She's got a chapter in there about your students, my students, my teachers. And
Yep.
So she has some testimonials and some stories to tell, because that's who Gayle is. And after teaching for 55 years, you certainly have seen some things. The beauty about this one, Brian, is that this Learning Years book is actually free to download.
Yeah,
So
she talks about that. Yep.
You could download it at learningears.com, and download the book. All you got to do is pop in your email address, and away it goes, and you're suddenly reading.
Yeah, there's
modern technology.
There's even a survey on there to kind of, if you want to take some extra steps and see if having a consultative call with Gayle and her team is right for you. There's that survey they can take, and she just gives a lot of great information through stories, essentially. And like I said earlier in the episode, who doesn't love a great story?
Her background is really interesting. That she goes over kind of how she got to using music in learning, and all the different mentors that she had along the way. And it was interesting because we have a podcast coming up with Alex Doman, and she actually worked with his grandfather.
Wow. So
his grandfather popped into town, into LA, and she would go in there as a teacher, learning from the Doman Delicato method. So this goes back generations upon generations, and that's where she learned how to kind of think outside the box. Because the way she put it to me last night, and we were talking after the episode, is she was saying that you have certain people that just will never give up on kids.
Yep.
And when you have that kind of thought process that you're never going to give up, you're going to always try to find something or some kind of wedge that will allow the children to prosper and the family to hope. And she was pointing out that, the Doman and Delicato back in the day were those people. And she learned from them, and then she, went on and learned from Pat Lindemood, who's had the Lindemood Bell program based out of Southern California as well, still in operation after all these years. That was back in the 70s.
Wow.
So when programs work, the programs last.
Yep.
And she goes into that, that here in the episode. And once again, I find myself still learning after having worked with her since the late 90s.
Yeah.
So it's always a pleasure to have Gayle with us. And now that she has her book, everybody else can start to learn from her as well.
Yeah, I agree. So let's get into this episode and hear Gayle's story and talk a little bit more with Gayle Moyers. Hello, I'm Brian with Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast, and I'm here with
Darren McCarthy,
our co-host.
We are here today with Gayle Moyers. one of our special guests. And Gayle, I met Gayle in 1998 in San Diego. And the long and short story is that she said if I'm willing to work for $6 an hour, she'll teach me everything she knows. And I think what she didn't realize is that 30 years later, she'd still be teaching me. So I think in the end, I actually got the better deal. Gayle, why don't you give us a little bit of background about your, how you came to education and so on and so forth?
That's actually to me, it's an interesting story because I came to education very reluctantly. I wanted to be, I loved learning from the get-go. Going to school and learning was the best part of all my life. And from the kindergarten on up, it was my salvation. And then, so I started learning and got very excited about it. And then I went to college, but I really wanted to be something impressive, like pediatrician, or maybe even, I wanted to really be a dental hygienist. And I found a program, and it was out of state. It was in state, but out of town, so I couldn't live at home. And my father didn't believe that women should go to college. He said, you just go there to look for a husband. And I said, but that's good shopping. No. So I had to work my way through college on my own. And they didn't have a dental hygiene program at San Diego State University, but they were very well known for their teaching program. And so I thought, well, I used to think wrongly that people that went into teaching did that because they couldn't do anything else. That was where all the remedial people went from college. And so I ended up in teaching, and worst of all, I ended up in elementary school, which is where the real dum-dums went. Now that's all a myth, so you can erase that from your mind right now. So I went to San Diego State University, put myself through college, and San Diego State had an incredible teacher training program. We had more on-hands training than anybody I met the first year I was teaching. And as soon as I walked into that little first grade classroom, and the first kid grabbed hold of my leg and rode it around the room all day and cried big tears, I was hooked. And the wonderful thing about first grade is they're like little light bulbs popping on. And that's one of the reasons I have the light bulb as a logo for my Learning Years book. But
interesting.
Going from there, and I always got a job. I never went in for a personal interview because San Diego State had such a good reputation. So I started out 2 years in the Chicago area, and then a year in Palos Verdes, where I had the best principal of my life, Keith Watson, and then back to San Diego and started having my 3 kids. And I didn't miss teaching because motherhood is kind of like learning too. And
yeah,
so
there I went.
Yeah, parenthood, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They don't have a text for that, darn it.
No.
We're still waiting for it.
They try, but they don't know how our kids behave.
Yeah.
So then I wanted to go back to school, but I did not want to be in the classroom because I had my mini classroom at home. And I joined the Greater San Diego Reading Association, and the first guest speaker there was Patricia Lindemood of Lindemood Bell. And I was fascinated by her presentation. In those days, this was in the 70s, but it started in the 60s, we were taught that the brain either gets itself together by the time they're 8, or they're not going to be having the basic skills that people get automatically. Of course, we know that's not true now.
Right.
And so what we did in those days is if traditional reading didn't work, we'd find another way or another sensory system. So things came out to go around to the back door of learning instead of coming through the front door. And so I studied her method, and it was very successful. And I started tutoring at home, and Poway Unified heard I was doing that. They called me up one day and wanted to hire me as a reading specialist. And I said, well, I don't have a degree in that. And they said, we don't require it. We can put you as a teacher on special assignment. So I went to Poway for, I think, 5 years. And, excuse me, sorry. And I put, Poway, I started out at a school that was 11th down out of 12. And in 4 years, I had it number 1. And the reason I had it number 1 is I didn't teach in the traditional ways. And Pat Lindemood just mentored me through that whole thing. And what I learned there is everybody's smart enough.
I think it's important to note, it's important to note, Brian, that there's a lot of reading programs and educational programs that come and go.
Sure.
So, the latest trend, the latest, research begets the latest thing. And the people that Gayle are talking about and herself have had programs that have been going since the 70s.
Sure.
And they never stopped.
Yeah.
So that's, that shows you that the foundation of those programs are essential, maybe even more essential than the research,
Sure.
that begets some of these trends. What do you think, Gayle?
I think that's true. And let's add on to that, because I eventually left the school district because I was very frustrated with the bureaucracy. And when I had a method that I had developed, that the remedial students were making more gains per year than the classroom students, and the principal asked me not to do it anymore. Can I confess here? So I renamed it and did it anymore anyway, because it worked, and I wasn't going to deprive the children of their ability to improve their reading the most. So
right. And from there, you got Moyers Learning Center started.
That's it, exactly. It came right then. My husband said, why don't you do this on your own? And so I did. And it was then that I started branching away from all traditional teaching, because the exciting thing is I learned about music and learning. And some of you may remember, the Mozart effect and how that was going to teach people of all ages actually to learn better. And it was really about Mozart and the Mozart music. And there's a very interesting sidebar about music. When we study the Mozart music, it always works better for learning and depression than the other composers of the same music era.
Huh.
And it's kind of interesting. So there's a woman named Brandes Verdes in Austria, and she's not only a musician, but she's a researcher of music. So she took Mozart and studied him compared to the other classic era of music. And what she found out was Mozart was the only one that had a different rhythm pattern in his music. It wasn't about the notes and what the sounds were, it was about the rhythm. So then she composed her own music using the rhythm of Mozart, and her music worked just as well on depression. Isn't that fascinating?
Really fascinating.
Yeah. Wow.
And we know that music crosses all countries, cultures. Music and rhythm are almost always used as a healing agent in every culture. And we know that in our culture, at least I know this because I've watched it work, it doesn't matter if we're rich or poor, black or brown or purple, it crosses all, it's just a human healing agent. And it has to do with the rhythm. So then I opened Moyers Learning Systems, and I had no constraints. But I will tell you this, the unfortunate piece, as our science goes through and we do research on spelling or reading programs or this or that, almost none of that reaches our classrooms. And I think the bottleneck is at the university training level, because we talk about having enough knowledge and experience and then expertise to do what we want to do to help a reader. But the university professors have spent probably no more than a year and a half in an actual classroom. and they're still teaching to the same theories that we had in the 60s and 70s. When I opened Moyers Center, I hired 5 special education trained teachers. And in about 2 years, right, Darren?
Yep.
We could get them up and running in the center without leaning on me very much. I went to these 5 teachers one day and I said, what was it in your university training for your special ed credential that was useful here? And all 5 raised their hands with a big fat 0. And I found that to be true often. So we worked there at Moyers, and we literally put the school districts on their ear. Parents were actually going to court to challenge the systems that they were teaching their children in special education that weren't working. And then the court ordered the school district to pay and send them to us. And the Learning Center was a great laboratory because you weren't stuck with the rules of a bureaucracy. You couldn't hit kids or anything, but you weren't stuck.
Let me make a quick differentiation there too, because like on the East Coast, when we talk about a learning center, it's typically like a daycare or a preschool kind of environment. The learning center concept on the West Coast is very different. Right? And I think Moyers Center was a perfect example of that differentiation.
Yeah, there's a difference between giving a kid crutches and letting him learn to walk.
Yeah.
So tutoring, I think, relates to the crutches. They always need that tutor to help them how to focus, help them how to think. They kind of teach them to memorize the answers rather than think through and discover the answers. But if you get really good, automatic, solid reading skills going, their brains can do it on their own.
It's probably a good place for you to discuss your how we learn versus what we learn.
Yes. And I've got to tell this one story that Tina told me. I know from my experience that every student is smart enough. And there's a second part of this. They'll say, well, they don't have the personality. They don't care. You have to realize that personalities come about because they're protection, their self-protection, defense. Mm-hmm. And we know that statistically, K3, most of the students, almost all, will believe if I work harder, I'll be smarter. And then they do, they work harder. But then they're still not getting to grade level or getting the grades they want. And they're working harder, but they're not getting any result. So about 4th grade, you'll see your kiddos don't care. I don't care. Because it's better not to care than to appear dumb. And that's very reliable. And I have a story from a 16-year-old that we put on our Learning Years music and voice program. And we'll go into that a little bit more later. But Jonathan went through the program and was transformed, which is not unusual. He was 16 years old and wasn't focusing in, wasn't present. And he said, after the program was finished, he made such a transformation, we decided to interview him on video. And he said, yeah, people thought I didn't care, but I did. I was kind of like a floater, he said. And that to me is he couldn't find himself, which is part of the Learning Years training.
Sure.
So he said, but now I do care and I can do it. And now my brother gets in trouble because I can follow directions. I just love that part. I love the part that people thought I didn't care, but I do.
Sure.
And the second part of this, why I hooked onto the music, was Tina. Tina was a 3rd grader with a diagnosis of dyslexia and dysgraphia and one of the other visual processing disorders. And she couldn't write, she couldn't spell, she couldn't read. She was pretty good at talking. And I took her through a reading test profile, and I gave her a word reading test. And She read 78 of the words before we stopped because she was starting to miss them all. And she would typically look at a word like uncle and say lunch. So everybody, the teachers and parents would say, see, she's dyslexic. She scrambles the letters. The letters are moving. And that's actually a myth. That's never true. And so I took Tina back through the same test we just read, those 78 words. And I said, Tina, this time let's try something. You start at the front of the word and tell me the letters from the front to the end. I never told her where the front was. In all 78 words, she never missed a letter. She never shifted the orders of the letter. She never left a letter out. And she even got her B's and D's correctly named, which surprised me. So then I asked her, I said, well, what do you think makes reading and spelling hard for you? And she quickly said, I know what it is. I'm just kind of like, thanks for asking. It's my ears. They trick me. I can't tell if what I say matches what I see. And therein lies the answer to the whole problem. It's my ears.
That's amazing. Gayle, I had last week, I have a client, one of my students said the exact same thing.
He didn't.
He did.
Wow.
And I was taken aback at first, but he was just kind of, he paused, sat back, and he said the exact same thing. And I was stunned because the first time I heard you say that was, back in, 2000. And
yeah.
if it's a area of difficulty, it's not time that fixes it. In our system, it's different programs and pioneers like yourself coming up ways to address the actual problem.
Right. And the answer comes in the ears. And my favorite quote from Moyers is, how we are in the world depends upon our response to sound. And if you can give these kids an audiogram, now not a hearing test, in the audiogram, we're looking for, are they in the normal range of hearing, both in air conduction and bone conduction? And are the lines significantly in balance with each other, or are they tangled? And you will almost always see a tangled line. They call it the ear-bone gap in children that are dyslexic. But that's not important. That was Dr. Tomatis from France who discovered that we could retrain that ear to process sounds. It's like delayed development. Just like a child can be a late walker or a late speaker. Most of the children with the delayed auditory development for their ear development are going to be late talkers. And oftentimes they will be late walkers because it's our ears that put us into how we balance, where we are in time and place. They put us into our vision, what's far and near, and can we find like a hidden picture? Believe it or not, our ears get us organized for that kind of thinking.
So your career really took a shift when you started to discover the importance of the auditory system in learning.
A complete shift.
Was there a particular time that you remember like making that shift or?
I do, because I was getting good results with, say, for instance, the Lindemann Bell system. Not every child does well on that program. But when I started with music, it was when I met Stephanie Merritt. I took a class at the university about how to use music for better learning. And I got hooked, really hooked. And so I started using the program with students at the center, and we had incredible results. I have to just tell you about my one person. It's in my book, Nate. And he came into us, couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't read, couldn't write. He had a special education program for 3 years. They tried to teach him to write his name, 4-letter name, and he couldn't learn it. And he had 18 special appointments each and every week. So the mother asked me if I would take him into the learning center because we were doing our first Learning Years program. And I said, I really can't take him because he's beyond my area of expertise. And she says, oh, please, please. So I said, well, I can't guarantee anything because I've not used this program with those types of students. Well and behold, we gave him the Learning Ears method, and he now speaks and talks and walks, plays golf, and works on the internet and can write. And that, to me, there's a catch on Nate. He was only born with half a brain. And in spite of that, he did all of that. Wow. And it was the music that makes the difference. And the music with the ear voice training, what we need to do is to get our students connected so that when they hear uncle instead of lunch, they can then see it doesn't match up because they can monitor their own spoken response. And that's what these two children were sharing with us. So, how do you think?
Yeah, talk a little bit about kind of what, led to Learning Ears, and maybe head towards the book and what folks can find in there when they do download it.
Well, I thought it was really interesting that I wanted to always write a book, my students, my teachers, because once you start working with students, if we pay attention, we're going to learn. Like these two children that told us what we needed to hear. It's my ears, folks. And so once I started to do that, then thanks to the two of you, you invited me to meet someone that could help me write a book. And we decided to tell my journey. So Learning Ears is about my journey of learning about the magic of music. For myself personally, I share all of that in the book, made myself quite vulnerable. And that we go through, music is a healer. It's a healer for the brain to work and learn better. And it's a healer for the heart and soul to find the real Gayle. And that's what I learned when I started studying music and learning. And it's magical, and yet it isn't, because it's very structured. And there's a book called The Structure of Magic. And something can appear magical, but it works because it's very structured. And students need structure and sequence. And the music is a paradigm for that.
One of your contentions is that just implementing music, or the right music for a particular goal, will make changes on its own.
It will. Correct? It will.
Yeah, I remember, like you said, you actually sent me to the Stephanie Merritt's class.
Yes.
And just to give people an idea, let me tell a little quick story, because Gayle put me there. So she led this class. There was 8 of us in the room, and we had all a piece of paper with a circle on it. We were going to listen to one piece of music, and then we were going to all draw pictures. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, okay, Gayle sent me here. Must be a reason. And so we listened to the piece of music, and it was a piece by Debussy, and sat down and drew our pictures. And 8 out of the 8 people had a drawing of the woods, some formation of nature, and a deer in it, right?
Wow.
Right.
The piece of music was called Afternoon of a Fawn.
Wow.
I was so taken aback by that. I mean, that turned me. Maybe you sent me to the same person so that I kind of believed what you were doing. But just from a music perspective, it makes a lot of sense. And just to kind of add to that piece, Gayle worked with a friend of ours, Christy Criney, on her PhD. Yep. And she was her whole backdrop was, how do I take all the research that's been done with music and formulate this PhD, her thesis. And there's so much research behind using music and learning that's just kind of on a shelf with all this dust on it, because for one reason or another, they don't want to get into it.
Sure.
And whoever they might be. But just the music alone, right, Gayle?
Right. And the hardest thing about music, and just to put it together with learning, is that's not how we think about learning. You know, what does music have to do with it? Mm-hmm. And music has everything to do with it. That's one of those things where the research just doesn't meet the classroom. And the thing that I learned, and again from myself and my students, is that we have two of us. I have two of me. I have what I call the outside in Gayle, which is what the church says you're supposed to be, the parent says you're supposed to be, the school says you're supposed to be, the society says you're supposed to be. And then there's the inside out Gayle that is my truth. And it's absolutely my truth. And the language of the inside is the pictures, like the Bambi picture that he drew. Sure. And the music never pulls up what we're not ready to look at. But if you look at your truth, then you'll find, for instance, just a personal aside here, I took 12 lessons from Stephanie, this gal that Darren and I went to. And halfway through, I had a major shift in what I was drawing after each session. And the first ones, I was in the picture, but I looked like a ghost. It was like there wasn't really a Gayle there. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, about halfway through here, I got this picture of myself behind a frame that would have been a frame for a picture, but I was holding it and I was there and I was totally colored in and whole. And we, and I named it reframing. So I got to my inside out truth from my imagery. And boy, then I really took off. And I started these lessons at the Moyers Learning Center, and it was phenomenal. We got more gains in reading. I got one student, I only had him for 15 days, and every day he started his lessons with a 7-minute listening, 7 to 10 minutes of listening. You listen the second time and draw while you're listening, and then you explain your experience with the listening and whatever you want to say about your picture to your teacher. At the same time, the teacher does the same thing back to the student. And this child was diagnosed with an expressive language disorder, which is why I put that lesson in his day, and reading, dyslexia, dysgraphia, and ADD. And he was actually on Ritalin when he started. And then on the final testing, on the 15th day, he wasn't on Ritalin. He'd run out. And his reading scores went up 3 years on that word reading test. 3 years. Well, then talk about getting hooked. I was really hooked.
Now you're all in, yeah. Maybe you can explain to Brian, because I think some people are like, well, I picture my children using classical music, and it's kind of like, so can you explain kind of what you've seen when kids, first of all, listen to classical music, sometimes for the first time, and then the other piece is when they hear their voice through the microphone work and kind of hear themselves for the first time.
Right, and that was part of Jonathan's story. He was about, Learning Ears is a 20-week program of listening and voice training. And he was in about week 8, walking into Costco with his mother, and he said, wait. And Mom said, that was the first miracle, because the kid never shut up. And then, wait, I was talking louder than anybody here, wasn't I? And she thought, no, duh. She said, that's right, Jonathan. And he said, I never heard myself before.
Wow.
That is a wow.
Yeah.
That is a wow. And we take so much for granted. And that's why I wanted to write the book. And it has a lot of my story and a lot of my students' story.
And so when the kids listen to, kids that normally might listen to rap music or pop music or whatever, when they start to listen to classical music, what do you see as their responses? Maybe you have an anecdote there.
I do. In fact, one of my first pieces, when I have a student comes in with a 5-pronged diagnosis like the one I just told you about, and I didn't tell you about the 5th one, it was a demeanor of anger. And I didn't want to take him as a student. I mean, who'd want a student like that? And you're going to have, he's going to act out and challenge the teachers on his behavior and that kind of thing. So I said to Mom, is he bribable? Mom said, yeah, he wants a snowboard. And I said, well, can you afford one? And she says, if I want to. And I said, well, and she said, okay. So I said to the kiddo, I said, here's the deal. You come here for 3 weeks. He was the one that the reading scores went up 3 years. Mm-hmm. You come here 3 weeks, and all you have to do is 1, do your best, and 2, show respect. And I get to decide what respect is. Shake, shake. And so we started every day with the music. Well, the first one I pick usually with a kid that's frustrated and angry is Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, because cut number 7 in there is the storm. And Beethoven was a very frustrated, disappointed man because of his hearing loss. And that music, remember the Bambi? Mm-hmm. When Debussy wrote that piece, he had been somewhere, and the Bambi that he saw described it was a fawn. I call it Bambi.
Yeah. Bambi was a fawn. That's fair.
And he, and we found this with other pieces of music, but when they draw a picture, it kind of leads me to what I'm going to pick next. But the interesting thing about this kiddo, I'm not using his name, is that he, when I let him hear his first classical piece of music, he just looked up and he said, well, I can listen to this, but I hate classical. If you pick the right piece of music, they will entrain. There's an entrainment things that happens. Your body feels it, your heart feels it. I call music the cement between the bricks, because if we look at the brain as a 3-level brain, then you have the lower brain, which is the survival brain, and that's where you get the fight and flight, fight or flight. Right. You run away or you duke it out, you get yourself into trouble. Sure. Middle brain is the heart brain, the emotional brain, and the intuition. The upper brain is the new thinking brain, the neocognitive brain. However, those things are hierarchical. So if you have any static in the survival brain or any static in the emotional brain, there is no neocognitive going to work. And look at what tutoring is. Tutoring is going to that neocognitive brain when there's too much static below that interferes with even getting into that brain. So that's where you have kids do a lot of special education, special tutoring, but they're not dealing. Well, guess what? Music puts the whole thing together. It calms the survival brain. It tunes you in to your heart brain, and there you can get to your neocognitive brain. And that's where I call music is the mortar between the bricks. It pulls it all together. To make it short, I call it the integrator.
Sure.
It integrates the brain so that you have a brain for learning.
When a parent goes to learningears.com, and I know you have a survey up there, what can they expect? I mean, what's coming out of that survey?
What's coming out of that survey is whether or not they're going to be a good fit for a Learning Ears home program. And it rules in or rules out what your goals are, what are the behaviors you're seeing, and if you put the behaviors, we rank them. This is okay for this kiddo. He doesn't have any problem with sports, good at sports, good at this, good at that. And then up to a 4, can't pay attention, isn't motivated, 4. Those things get sorted out on this survey, and then we'll know if you have a fit or not for a home-based Learning Ears program, which is only 20 weeks.
Okay. Wow.
So it's not just you fill a survey out and get a free book as a download. Seems like there's more to the service than just that.
Right. It's helping you find your way to a place where you can meet your goals for your kiddo. He's smart enough. So what is going to change his life educationally to get him home, to bring him home?
Well, I think, Brian, we can have Gayle on every week.
All right.
Well, this is really helpful.
Thanks for letting me speak my passion.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And no, we invite people to go to learningears.com, get the free download, take that survey, and there are other steps after the fact. If they want to have a consultative call and a follow-up, there's options there too. But taking that 1 minute listening learning survey you can learn a lot. Let's put it that way. And I can almost guarantee that learning a lot coming from your book as well.
Well, and that's why I wrote the book, because a lot of books are really, really good. I mean, I've got a shelf full of them here, but they're too thick. They're too dense.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's like putting on a wool garment when it's not cold enough, But this book was written, never mind the professionals. This was written for the professionals and the teachers that want to improve their hindsight for teaching.
And the parents as well, obviously.
Read. It's really an easy read.
And who doesn't love a good story?
Yeah. I don't know. My kids might object to something.
Well, great stuff, Gayle. We appreciate your time.
Oh, I appreciate the chance, the opportunity.
Good stuff.
Look forward to it.
All right. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast with your hosts, Darren and Brian. Find them on social media at Sound Foundations for Parenting. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and subscribe. And we'll catch you next time on the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast.